Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd, and today I want to talk about the self-replicating minefield that was invented by O'Brien and Rome in the last episode of Season 5 of Deep Space Nine. And the whole idea of this kind of minefield is a little bit fishy, scientifically speaking, because they seem to imply that it's able to replicate itself endlessly, and so where does the energy or the mass come from to keep making new mines? And it took the Dominion many months to be able to dismantle this minefield, and so it really raises a lot of strange questions. And one of the theories is that Ducat deliberately took his time to dismantle those mines because he actually secretly didn't want the Dominion to bring in more ships, because he wanted to betray the Dominion at some point in the future so that he will be the only ruler of the Alpha Quadrant. So he wanted to use them to defeat the Federation and Klingons, but in the end of the day he didn't want to be under them, so maybe he deliberately was stalling, he deliberately didn't want to deal with even more Dominion forces later on because he was winning the war anyway. But I don't really buy this theory, because first of all, wouldn't the Dominion try to do something even without Ducat? Like, would they really rely only on Ducat? Wouldn't some Dominion ships try to do something even without the station? And so I don't really buy this theory, and also we saw that he was eager to destroy the minefield, and he was absolutely devastated when he didn't succeed to bring in the reinforcements. It was one of the reasons he went nuts in the end, and so I don't really buy this theory. I think if there was a way to do it, the Dominion would have done it even without Ducat, and they probably tried. We had a few months missing, meaning before Season 6 started. I think it was 3 months since the end of Season 5, and so I'm sure we simply missed seeing how the Dominion tried to get through the minefield. Maybe they lost a bunch of ships trying to do it, maybe they tried shooting at the minefield and it didn't work, and presumably the minefield was so close to the wormhole that maybe they couldn't shoot too much at it without damaging the wormhole, which they didn't want to do. So that might also have been a factor in why they couldn't dismantle this minefield more quickly, because probably they couldn't use certain weapons near the wormhole without disrupting the wormhole itself, and so that's why they couldn't simply detonate huge numbers of torpedoes or maybe heavier weapons near the minefield, because then they would risk damaging the wormhole, and because of that they had to very carefully dismantle it. And I think there was a big missed opportunity with all of this in terms of technobubble. I think there was something that was established in TNG which could have been used to explain why this minefield was so unstoppable, impenetrable, and that was the phase cloak that was introduced in the episode Pegasus. We know that Starfleet secretly developed the phase cloak, which means when you cloak a ship in that way, it's not only undetectable, but it can also pass through normal matter. So it can hide inside of a planet, it can get through other ships, and presumably it's also unaffected by any conventional weapons. And we also know from a different episode called The Next Phase that both the Klingons and Romulans were also working on that kind of cloaking device, and the Romulans apparently were close to completing it, and that's why Geordi and Ensign Rowe accidentally got cloaked with the phase cloak, and they could pass through anything. And so later we saw that Starfleet secretly developed that kind of cloaking technology, but then Picard revealed it to the Romulans because it was a violation of the Treaty of Algeron, and so presumably Starfleet gave up that cloaking device. Maybe they destroyed it, or maybe they locked it away somehow with the agreement of the Romulans that it would never be used. And my theory is that maybe the Federation and the Romulans decided to keep this cloak under lock and key together in case they ever needed to deal with a bigger threat such as the Borg. And after the Dominion became known, maybe that was when Starfleet and the Romulans started cooperating, and we know that the Romulans gave their own cloaking technology to the Defiant in exchange for the Defiant sharing everything they learned about the Dominion with the Romulans. And so there was obviously a cooperation, and so they basically modified the Treaty of Algeron to allow Starfleet to use cloaking technology against the Dominion under certain conditions with the agreement of the Romulans. And we know that Cisco kind of violated that a few times because he started using the cloaking device in the Alpha Quadrant as well, which was not allowed by the Romulans, but he did it anyway. And it's possible that once the Romulans signed their non-aggression pact with the Dominion, it also nullified the Treaty of Algeron, because maybe when they modified it the first time, when they decided to let the Defiant use the cloaking technology, maybe they also had a paragraph in it saying that if the Romulans suddenly switched sides and sided with the Dominion, then Starfleet will no longer be obligated to refrain from using cloaking technology. And it can also explain what we saw in Star Trek Insurrection, in which we saw that there was some kind of cloaked ship which the Federation planned to use on that planet in insurrection. So apparently Starfleet started to use cloaking technology during the Dominion War. We didn't really see that much, maybe because this was a hard technology to replicate, or maybe Starfleet simply didn't bother to put cloaking technology on ships because they knew that Dominion can detect cloaked ships anyway, and so they didn't bother wasting resources on that. However, cloaked mines were said to be undetectable by any known sensor array, and that's why it was useful to use it on a minefield, but we still don't really know what type of cloaks they used. Presumably they simply replicated the Romulan cloak they had on the Defiant and put a copy of it on all of those mines, but would the Romulan cloak defend the mines from weapons fire? And so what if the Dominion fleet simply started bombarding all the area with phasers or torpedoes? Would those mines really survive even if they can replicate themselves magically? Can they simply overwhelm the replication system that they wouldn't be able to catch up to it and destroy all the mines? And so it doesn't really make sense that they were just cloaked with a normal cloak. So if I was writing that episode, I would simply add the line that that's not a normal cloak, but that's actually the phase cloak that Pegasus developed, and that's why the Dominion weapons are useless against it, and that's why the mines would be so effective also, because maybe they can penetrate into the ship they're attacking and then explode inside the ship, and that would make it much more deadly. And we actually saw those kinds of mines in another episode of Deep Space Nine, the Siege of AR-558, in which we saw a Dominion minefield on a planet, and the mines were, quote, hiding in subspace and appeared once in a while to kill people on the planet, and apparently you could pass through them. So they were not just cloaked, they were actually phase cloaked, meaning that you cannot touch them until they explode randomly. And so this seems to be the same idea as I'm suggesting, and so maybe the Dominion actually managed to capture some of those mines around the wormhole and took them for study, and then it eventually produced its own version of it, which we saw in AR-558. That also might have been an interesting idea to explore in that episode. Maybe they should have mentioned that this is based on the mines that they themselves designed, and then the Dominion captured that technology and are now using it against them. That could have been an interesting twist in that episode. And a lot of people complained about this whole idea of the minefield around the wormhole because of that line that apparently it can simply replicate itself endlessly, and so where does the energy and the mass come from? And also back in season 4 we had an episode in which the Klingons tried to put a minefield around the entire Bajoran system in order to cut it off in case of a war with the Dominion, and Cisco sabotaged their plan and destroyed their minefield by stealing their codes of the minefield using Worf's brother, and then they destroyed that whole minefield. But actually, no, that could have been very useful against the Dominion. So even if they break through the minefield you put around the wormhole, you would still be able to cut them off from the rest of the quadrant, at least for a while. And so I'm actually not sure they should have interrupted the Klingons in doing that, but that seems to indicate that it is possible to mine an entire star system, which seems to be much harder to do than to simply mine a small area around the wormhole. So I actually have bigger logical problems with that Klingon minefield in that episode compared to the one we had around the wormhole, because we even saw that those mines were really close together. So if you're going to put that many mines around an entire star system, it would literally take like an astronomical number of mines to do that, unless maybe you cannot go at warp anywhere you want around that system. Maybe it has all kinds of natural interferences and they're only able to get to that system through some kind of narrow path to and from it. Maybe if you try to get into the system anywhere else it wouldn't work. And that can also explain why we saw the Dominion fleet being so tightly packed together when it tried to stop the Federation from getting to Deep Space Nine in the episode Sacrifice of Angels, and that both fleets had to be so tightly together to fight each other. Why cannot they simply go around them? And so the only way to really explain that logically is to say that the only way to get to that system was through some kind of narrow path that you have to go through, and that's why you cannot really go around their fleet. Kind of like the scenario of the 300 Spartans who managed to stop the Persians because they had to go through some narrow path through the mountains. And so we can kind of imagine a similar version of it dealing with warp travel. So maybe it would be possible to go around that fleet, but then you wouldn't be able to go at high warp and you'll only go at impulse, and then it would take you years to bypass it from the side. So that's the only way I can explain that logical problem. So maybe the Klingons were only mining those specific pathways and not literally all the space around the whole system, which seems impossible. And speaking of the minefield around the wormhole, that seems much easier in comparison because the wormhole is not huge, it's big enough to allow ships to come through. And in one episode they said that even the Deep Space Nine station itself is too big to pass safely through the wormhole, that if it would fall into the wormhole, it would be torn apart. And so presumably the wormhole itself is smaller than the station. And so it really wouldn't take that many mines to properly protect it. And we never got any direct numbers, but judging by the size of the minefield we see, I would say that they actually put a pretty thick layer of a minefield on top of the wormhole. And so even without the replication system, it would take the Dominion hundreds and maybe even thousands of ships to blast their way through that minefield, even if it wasn't self-replicating before coming through. But as I explained, maybe the Dominion couldn't use any heavy weapons against that minefield because that might damage the wormhole, which they don't want to risk. And the only way they were able to defeat the minefield was by firing an anti-graviton beam at each mine and disabling its systems. They said they're only disabling its replication systems, but after that process was over, we saw that the mines are no longer cloaked. So presumably the anti-graviton beam also disabled its cloaking technology and also the shields of the mines. Why do I presume they had shields when it wasn't mentioned? Well, because they were able to destroy the entire minefield by shooting one phaser beam at it, and then it caused a chain reaction which destroyed the entire minefield. So presumably before they were deactivated, the mines were also able to protect themselves from explosions of nearby mines, and therefore they either had to have shields, which seems impossible because we know that shields don't really work together with cloaking technology, but maybe they would only activate the shield and drop the cloak at a moment of explosion. Or they were using the phase cloak, which I mentioned, which really would have been the perfect explanation for how this kind of minefield can be practical. If they were using phase cloaks, then they wouldn't be affected by the explosion of nearby mines, and then it would make sense. And that's why I say that was the biggest missed opportunity in the dialogue explaining those mines. They should have simply said they were using the phase cloaking technology, and they could even explain it by saying that because the Romulans signed a deal with the Dominion, that's why Starfleet freed them from those limitations, or maybe they were blatantly violating that treaty, simply as a necessary evil to defend themselves from the Dominion, which was such an unstoppable force if they couldn't stop them from coming through, and that's why they had to do it. And so you can say that Cisco violated the treaty to protect the Alpha Quadrant, and they only did that after the Romulans switched sides. And maybe Starfleet secretly provide them with all this super duper brand new state-of-the-art technology to make it all possible. And that's why I also tend not to give Rom all the credit, which a lot of people blame him for everything. Even Weyun said that Rom was the diabolical genius who invented those self-replicating mines. But I say to that, we did see Rom brainstorming together with Dax and O'Brien about all of it, and he kind of gave them some of the ideas. But the ones who actually did all the work was O'Brien himself and presumably Starfleet, who provided them with all the necessary equipment and technology to make it possible. And that can also explain the goof of why did they wait so long. I mean, the Dominion went through the wormhole multiple times before any of this, and only now they suddenly decided to mine the wormhole, so why not earlier? It could have prevented the Dominion from becoming so strong before all of this. So one excuse is that they only did this necessary evil kind of action because the Romulans switched sides. Until then, maybe they thought they'll be able to handle the Dominion together with the Romulans. But I would say that they were simply postponing all of this to the last possible moment because they were still working on the technology that would enable this kind of cloaking field to be practical at all. And also maybe they were preparing the Federation for war, so maybe they were recalling all the long-range ships and gearing up all the ship productions, all the weapon productions, preparing all of Starfleet for the war. And only in the last possible second when they were ready, that's when they mined the wormhole, knowing that it will start the war. So that's my excuse for why they stalled for so long, and so that's why I cannot really give credit to Rom or even to O'Brien himself, because all the technology that made it possible was developed by the whole Federation and Starfleet. And it would have been interesting to bring in the phase cloak into all of this, because that would retrospectively make the episode Pegasus more interesting, because maybe Admiral Pressman indirectly saved the Federation in the end, even though he did something immoral and illegal. But in the end, the technology he developed actually did end up saving the Federation, so that would be kind of ironic and interesting to debate about. It would make that episode more interesting. And looking at the dialogue, obviously we don't see any mention of a phase cloak, but we can still speculate maybe that is how they did it. Maybe a normal cloak wouldn't really cut it in this situation. And if not for the phase cloak, that means they used the Romulan cloaks to do it. So how were they able to replicate the Romulan cloak, and would the Romulans agree to that? If they discover about all of this, wouldn't that make it even a bigger violation of the Treaty of Algeron? The fact that the Federation used their cloaking technology to put it on thousands of mines, that seems to be an even bigger violation than if they simply use the phase cloak. And the phase cloak would definitely be much more logical in this situation. It would explain why the Dominion cannot simply fire weapons at it, and why they are so scared of these mines that if they can explode inside the ship, that's much more devastating. And why in the end, when we see they detonate all the minefield, all of the mines explode one after the other in a domino effect. If that's how they explode, then how would that work before they disabled it? I mean, with normal cloaking, the shields wouldn't work, and so a mine exploding would destroy the mine next to it, and then all of them would get destroyed, and the only way it could have been prevented if it was phase cloaked. So in my own head canon, I kind of tend to imagine that they were phase cloaked and not just normal cloaked. And maybe before they destroyed that minefield, they also salvaged some of the mines in order to study them, and maybe that's what enabled the Dominion to later create those mines that we saw in AR-558, which also seem to be phase cloaked. And maybe they weren't able to use it in space, because then you would have to use it in such a large area, and the ships would simply be able to get around it, and then it wouldn't be an effective use of resources, and that's why we didn't see it being used by the Dominion in space. And so in my own headcanon, those were actually phase cloaks that they used on that minefield, and not Romulan cloaks, and that's why the Dominion couldn't do anything against it until they disabled all of the mines. And they had to disable all of them because of the self-replication system, because if they only disabled half the minefield and then tried to destroy it, then those mines that survive would simply refill the gaps with brand new mines. And that brings me to the most difficult question to answer, which is, how they bypass the law of the conservation of mass and energy. How could that minefield keep replicating itself forever? Wouldn't it still need the raw materials or the energy to keep producing new mines? It cannot do it forever, it makes no sense, that would make it magic. And I have a few theories about that. First of all, the conservation of mass. We know that they had to first deploy the whole minefield before activating it, so they cannot just drop one mine and just let it replicate endlessly until it surrounds the whole wormhole. And that indicates that there was indeed some kind of limit, that they cannot simply endlessly replicate these mines in space without any assistance. Otherwise they wouldn't need the Defiant to spend all that time going around the wormhole, putting layers and layers on the mines before activating them, if they can simply drop one mine and have it replicated by itself. And so obviously there is some kind of physical limit. And also they were designed to replicate after they hit the Dominion ships, and so presumably if they destroy Dominion ships, there would be a lot of wreckage all around the mines, and maybe they would be able to use that wreckage, those raw materials, to produce new mines. It's possible those mines also have a transportation system. We actually know that a replicator can be converted to become a transporter. That is something that was mentioned in another episode of Deep Space Nine, that it is possible to turn a replicator into a transporter, and so presumably those mines would be able to beam raw materials from their surroundings and then use them in their replication system to produce new mines. And so once they take out Dominion ships, they might be able to use the wreckage or even the energy coming from the explosion to produce new mines. And even if just the mines themselves explode from weapons fired at it, maybe also the surrounding mines can immediately beam all those materials and produce new mines from them. And so technically it would be more like self-repairing minefield and not just a magically replicating minefield. So they wouldn't be able to produce matter out of nothing, but they can do it out of a different matter or from an energy source. And speaking of an energy source, all of this minefield is sitting right on top of a wormhole, which obviously is also generating some kind of energy, because we heard many times across the show that the wormhole is emitting neutrinos or all kinds of energy particles, and we can also see the light out of it. So obviously the wormhole itself is emitting all kinds of energies in various forms, and so it's possible that the mines can also harness energy from the wormhole itself. And that can also explain why they never use this kind of minefield anywhere else, because it wouldn't work that way anywhere else, because they do need a power source. And so sitting right on top of the wormhole might have given them all the energy they would need. And if a mine explodes, maybe the mines around it can immediately pick out all the energy and matter emanating from that explosion, and then simply recycling it. So if one mine gets disintegrated, other minds simply put it back together. That's how you can look at it, and that way there is no real violation of the conservation of mass and energy. Of course, it would be impossible for a minefield to capture every single atom and every single bit of radiation from an explosion, and so some energy must have been lost, but we have the wormhole to explain that maybe they draw some kind of energy from the wormhole itself. And also I presume there was some kind of limit, meaning if the Dominion simply kept shooting at the minefield and the mines kept replicating, eventually they would start running out of materials or energy and eventually stop working. But you wouldn't be able to take out every single mine because, remind you, it's a cloaked minefield, and so some ships would still be lost, and the Dominion didn't want to risk losing part of their ships, and so that's why they prefer to simply wait until they take out the entire minefield at once. And so since they were winning the war until that point anyway, they didn't want to risk losing any of those ships simply because they're in such a hurry, because they were not in such a hurry. They thought they are winning, and so they prefer to dismantle the entire minefield first and only then bring the fleet over. But presumably, if they really wanted to, they could probably destroy most of the minefield simply by shooting all their weapons from multiple ships. But also, as I explained, they didn't want to risk damaging the wormhole itself, and that could also have been a limiting factor in why they couldn't dismantle the minefield quicker than this. So I think I covered all the points I wanted to talk about. So I do wish the Technobabble dialogue would have been a little bit better to make all of this a little bit plausible. They don't have to go into every single detail and explain everything, but they could have done it a little bit more cleverly, at least mention the phase cloak as I suggested, and then fans wouldn't be complaining about this part as much, because the Technobabble would sound at least slightly more plausible and not such a violation of the rules of physics as we know them today. But I think because we can invent all these kinds of theories to try to explain it and make sense of it, that's why I don't really have a huge issue with it. And I think the Dominion War was very interesting in Deep Space Nine, and I love it, and that's why I'm willing to make up all these excuses to try to make it all work logically, so that we can accept it and it wouldn't ruin our suspension of disbelief, it wouldn't make it sound stupid. And that's why I made this theory video, to try to make sense of all of this and to explain it in a way that would sound logical. And this way we can continue to enjoy these episodes. So that's all I had to say about it for today. Let me know what you think and we can discuss it in the comment section below. And I will see you all next time. Bye bye.